Okay, should we get started? I already have lunch in mind, so.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
We want a revolution.
Thanks, Corey.
In teacher mode, if you want to go and stand outside and wait for the buffet, you can. So I think when we first started talking about this session, we were going to have a debate. And I was really looking forward to watching these four scrap in front of you all, and then you getting to ask questions. But that's not what we're going to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by having a bit of a critical discussion. I don't really know what that is, so whether it's we are going to engage critically with the thinking, or whether you're going to be critical of each other, or we'll see.
Bit of both.
Bit of both.
Well, it's Tim, yeah. Tim.
Okay. So I have some burning questions, so I'm going to put to our esteemed panel here. There will be time for your own questions at the end, and of course the entire networking lunch break to grill them about your own questions. So lots of time for further discussion. I feel like we've had today already, I feel like I've heard lots of new and interesting things, and my head feels like it's already buzzing. So it feels nice to hand over to you guys to kind of share some of your reflections. So I've got some questions. I'm going to put my glasses on so I can read my own very bad writing. So this is coming to you, Tracy and Tim, for starters. Okay, and then what I'm going to do in terms of procedure is then give Carl and Fiona a chance to chip in if they want to, or then I will move on to my next penetrating question. So, Tracy and Tim, what do you think the future of this field is in terms of theory-informed qualitative implementation research?
Honestly, I think you're asking the wrong people. Now, I mean that in a nice way. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think the where next and the escape attempts happen in part because of our funding environment. Yeah, we can't put a big bid in where it's radically new and radically news and those kind of things. Actually, it happens in PhDs. It's you lot. It's post-PhDs. It's postdocs. That's where the kind of next stuff is happening. And we are the wrong people because we're already embedded in our habits and routines. So I think it's kind of, I'm not trying to get out of it, but actually we've seen elements of it earlier on where next is. I mean, there's other conversations to be had, but that's my initial go at it. I could carry on, and I won't.
Yeah. I think my thoughts on this correspond really to what Tim's saying. I mean, it's okay for us to say, here, we've got these frameworks and you use them, theories, especially if it's MPT. And I always feel a little bit like, oh, God, I'm not the right person to be saying what to do around that. So I think I reflect you, actually, in that, Tim. But what I'd like to know is more about how useful they are and if they're not useful. Because funders expect us to put them in research grants, and we do that in a very neat way. You know, this is what we're going to do. But then when we work with it, like you saw yesterday, we go off in different directions, we do different things with them, it's much messier. And I'd like to understand more about how useful it is to people that are trying to get their head around them and apply them in their research projects, but also think about, it should be there for practice. And they may be less useful, or they can be made usable. And some of the work we do tries to achieve that, but we don't understand as much about that. And there's nearly always not enough room in the papers and the publications for the researchers, or they choose not to, I'm still not quite sure, more reflection.
But if we think about some of the escape attempts we saw earlier on, we had one around pace, and actually what would it mean to do it rapidly? And that's always going to be a thing, but I think there was the interesting question about how that can unfold technocratic issues and what's the difference between those kind of things. And the other is repurposing or learning from other fields. We saw that in QCA, and how we can do that in enabling ways and anything else, because this area is nothing else but parasitic. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I mean, it's a bit like criminology itself, in that sense that it relies on so many different areas. And I don't know if we've got all of those areas in the room. I think there's not a lot of kind of hardcore BCT health psychs in this room, and how that would kind of reshape some of that and reshape some of those directions. But anyway. So I think there's something about what the conditions of the possibility actually to really think differently. Actually, I think it is to go and learn a lot more from other disciplines and other areas and do more collaborative work. I would say that because I'm nosy and I like learning new things. But I think it is that learning from other fields and having a bit more modesty and actually, Not sure.
Can I push you a little bit on the frameworks? You know, so the implementation frameworks. Do you think those could be more useful for the work we do? Are there ways to make them, you know, work harder?
I think it's about us not treating them as holy objects and working with them creatively. And I think that's what reminds me of a lot of the BCT work that happens. It's, okay, have you done X, Y, and Z? And we see that in some of the MPT papers we review. I've done X, Y, and Z in a kind of deliberate fashion, but they should be. So Garfinkel talks about transcripts being aids to the sluggish imagination. And that's what these kind of frameworks, I think, should be. Aids to the sluggish imagination, just helping us think slightly differently, slowing down a bit, taking a bit of time out, and thinking about those kind of things. And I think, yeah, they should be devices to think with rather than coordinate our thinking in a kind of very narrow way.
Yeah, no, I agree too. And I think actually we can use them more flexibly. And I think we've been saying that about MPT for a lot of years. I'm looking to Carl and others. And we say that, but what I do get from people that are thinking about using it is, I'm really not sure I'm using it the right way, or you know, I've understood the construct right way, or I'm coding that bit of data to the right construct. And what I would say is that they're not the important things, really. It's about using it to think through what you're doing and to be a bit flexible. And if it doesn't work for everything or every bit, then don't use it for everything.
But that's as true as in qualitative research. I once went round, I worked in a big open plan office, and loads of people that have been in qualitative research for years and years and years in health. And I turned around and said, how do you do qualitative research? How do you do your coding? How do you do these things? And I needed it for lectures, and I took screenshots to do other things. Everyone I spoke to said, I don't do it properly, but this is the way I do it. I don't do it, and there was a constant accounting, as there should be, but there isn't a right way to do it, and we should be a bit more generous to ourselves around some of these things. I'm not saying use MPT, as Carl might say it, to perform an interpretive dance. There are kind of limits of where we can go around this kind of thing. But it is about having a bit of modesty about where it can go and what it can relate to.
Go on, he's taking a breath.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I need to overextend.
Carl or Fiona, would you like to chip in on this one before we move on?
I would actually. I think a real issue with theories and frameworks and models in implementation is that we actually have a very poor understanding of the processes on which they're imposed. You know, NPT, since Tracy and Tim have brought it up, not at all because I like it, began because we were trying to understand a real problem, which was why was the NHS in such trouble in adopting and bringing into practice telemedicine systems? Well, I mean, it came out of an empirical question. And I think we have a slightly better understanding of some of those things now. But we still have a poor understanding of the deep underlying processes of diffusion, adoption, embedding, practice. Because so much of what we're investigating is historically and politically contingent. And the underlying conditions of what we're looking at are constant. I mean, for those of you who were in Annette's masterclass in how to deliver a workshop before coffee, it was all about the politically contingent nature of knowledge and evidence, and how that's shaped relationally by lots of things that are happening in the world and by lots of relationships. NPT exists because I was in a meeting where somebody told me, I think Tim was also there,
Yes.
where somebody told me that there was no place for sociological theory in implementation science. And before that moment, I'd never thought about it. And after that moment, I devoted my life to it. I mean, these things are hugely contingent on often chance. Obviously, I don't want you to take away the message that everything is chance, because obviously I want to keep getting grants and writing papers, appearing on platforms like this. But there is something that and when Tim says we need humility and modesty, that's absolutely right. We do need humility and modesty. We don't understand really basic features of some of the things that we're investigating.
Anything to add?
No, I think we can keep going.
Well, I'm going to come to you next.
I thought you were going to.
Yes. So, what about the contribution of the kind of, more deep, substantial qualitative methods like ethnography, conversation analysis? I mean, we've talked a bit about, some of the more rapid ways we need to work if we want to engage with practice challenges, but these are methods that take time to do. So, what do you think their contribution can be going forward?
Well, I mean, I'd agree with what Tim said actually in terms of the idea that it is very parasitic. What we're trying to do is, and we need to learn from those methods. So I think there's very definitely a role for ethnography, and I do conversation analysis, so I'm sure I'd say that as well. For me, sometimes there's quite a lot of interviews and focus groups, quite a lot of bringing together what people think, and I think sometimes we don't have enough of what people actually do. So so for those who came to my workshop, I was talking about this COVID recovery project. One of my biggest issues is we never managed to be able to record the conversations that clinicians, when they're onboarding people onto an app, we never got those conversations. We just couldn't get the ethics and the governance through. So we had the agreement with clinicians to do it, but we just couldn't get the ethics through in the time according, with all the other processes. And I just think we've missed a chunk. So I think we need to be able to, not so much just using, I think we need to do more observation is probably my thing. I think we need to be there. And I appreciate, I think we've got a place for all these things. So I appreciate the idea of coming in rapidly to go and ask people what they think and keep doing it. And I really like what's coming out of here about the longitudinal element. But I also think there's nothing quite like it to just embed yourself somewhere, have the chance conversations, being able to listen to what people are saying, just kind of hang out, and also to have some of those recordings to do more analysis on to really understand what is happening, because lots of things happen around the edges, and that's what this is about. So for me, we need to think about, but also we need to think quite critically about and quite carefully about combining methods. I also like what we were talking about yesterday about, not saying, right, okay, we're going to go in and we'll do, we're going to observe for this amount of time, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. I think we need to think about how we're going to link data together, how we're going to think about what do we need in particular spaces, and how much flexibility can we build into this. And obviously, we keep coming back to the same thing. It's the same thing about funding, and how do you write that in? You've got to be a bit clever in terms of being allowing you to have the opportunity to change direction in terms of your methodological approach. And also, when might it be that we mix our methods up? When might it be useful to do some kind of quantitative measures, do something really quick? I think we just need to be really open, and open to people with different expertise and who see these situations really differently. So I work in an interdisciplinary way. I think we learn so much by working with other people in terms of how they might approach a problem, and then how they might analyse those data. So, I really like using conversation analysis for these in-depth questions, but you can get really, really great stuff by just getting people to analyse something, in a thematic way to just understand what's happening next. So I think we need to move away from being tied to, this is what I do, and this is exactly the method I'm going to use to do it. I mean, Tim's comment just now about, people say they do their qualitative methods differently and I'm not doing it properly or whatever. I think we need to get away from that idea, and what we need to do is move towards the idea of being sure that we've done something that's rigorous, that's fitted for the purpose, that's got the answers we need, and being able to be flexible and move around and change and work with different people and different disciplines to understand how best to get this. I think some of the issues have been where we've just got one particular perspective, and that's what we then put on top of it, as opposed to really understanding what's going on.
Does anyone else want to kind of comment on methods?
Yeah. One of the things that has, I think, really influenced my thinking about methods in relation to what you're talking about is when I began to do qualitative work, which was literally when dinosaurs ruled the earth, at the end of the 1980s. There were what you did when you did qualitative work was you transcribed all your interviews yourself, you knew data backwards before you did anything. You had no IT to support you. So I did all of my transcripts on a mainframe computer using bespoke word processing software that offered me one font. And I can't tell you what a joy that was to not have to worry about whether I'm using a program properly. But over time, qualitative work of all kinds, bar one, I think, has become mechanised. And people leap into coding transcripts without, as the first stage of analysis, but without thinking about what the overarching narrative of all the interviews is. They produce. In qualitative research in the United Kingdom, we lead the world in the mass production of themes. No nation produces more themes than the United Kingdom. We produce so many themes that we can only fit 3 or 4 in a paper. This leads, I think, has led to a kind of thematic reductionism in qualitative work. Now, conversation analysis is a really interesting case in point because there is no software. It relies on the skill, the artisan skill of the analyst and their capacity to make sense of data that is quite difficult to deal with in theoretically very powerful ways. And that's why so few people do it. There's no in vivo for it, so lots of people aren't going to do that work. And when you read Fiona's work or Jerry Layden's work or all of the people who do this kind of stuff, the thing that's really striking is how, from very small snippets of data, they produce extraordinary analytical work. If you look at the comparable, the huge body of thematic analysis in qualitative data, what you often read are mere descriptions of what people have said in interviews. There's no kind of there's no sort of theoretical often there's actually no explanation for this. Oh, they've said this. This is the natural world. It's like saying, look at all these tables, without saying, why are we having tables like this? You know. Sorry, that was a bit of a lecture. I didn't mean that.
It was a bit. I mean, but
Quite useful
interestingly,
for all of us, though. Like
but
free culminate qualitative methods lecture.
yeah. But interesting, so we teach a qualitative methods course, and in terms of the programs, we refuse to talk about programs and say, please don't touch one until you really understand your data, till you've read it all, till you've thought about it. The most important thing, and actually think about this when you're transcribing it. And the first part of analysis is transcription. You know, once you've got a transcript, you've already made a decision about what you're doing. So just be really careful. And actually, highlighters are your friend. You know, printing things out, highlighting what you do, that stops that mass production of themes. I do like that, though.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems with NVIDIA is it's really hard to change your codes. And it's just like, why? Why configure the user in that way?
Yeah.
But I want to disagree with the question, because I don't think necessarily CA or ethnography does depth. It depends on the practitioner. And there's some appallingly lightweight CA work and ethnographies. And actually there's some incredibly rich, mind-blowingly interesting interview studies. But that's because there's a kind of broader conversation about, I do like the idea of the mass production of themes.
I do.
And equally it's what Silverman years ago used to call the interview society, that we're surrounded by interviews. And actually what we do as social scientists is reproduce that culture of the celebrity interview, basically, as our kind of default position again and again and again. But I think there's something interesting about, so a kind of brief aside about the work that's needed in the UK context to get through ethics and governance to do ethnography, and in even worse, audio recording. But the worst thing you could possibly ask for is video.
Yes.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and it is best described as a lottery about which committee you go in front of, about whether they will tell you to go away or not. But then the ethics is easy compared to the HRA and data governance, where they don't understand what these terms mean. It's like going back when I was a Dalek 20, 30 years ago, they didn't understand what a qualitative was. Now they don't understand these kind of things. And the work that goes through that, it's kind of, you've got to be prepared to put the hours in to do that and to have really basic questions. So one of them is like, we wanted to do, look at multidisciplinary teams, what was going on in that space. And they said, well, can't the clinicians just take the notes and anonymise themselves? Well, no, because they've got to get on with their job. It was just like, there was just these kind of fundamental, and it was a list of these constant things. So there's something about the pragmatics of that. Be prepared for the randomness of it. But I think the reason for doing that stuff is to getting access to things, because I am really interested in what people do rather than what they tell you they do. But you can do some of that observation work in and through doing your interviews. You see a lot of that work in the process of being there. You see that a lot of that work about how their work is and what it is in the process of recruiting people. So we should always have a kind of ethnographic vision about the broader kind of way we're working through. So we get access to some of these moments of corridor talk. So we get access to some of these moments of how they're situated in the kind of broader sense. Yeah, anyway.
I mean, I just add to that actually, and I think that's been one, and I seem to be in a minority. Everybody's loving these online interviews.
Yeah.
For me, it's the biggest issue out, but because of exactly what you've just said. So I tell everybody, you know, the most important part of this is your field notes. So you need to tell me about what happened. How did you recruit this? What was happening? You know, how did you do this? All this needs to be captured. And then afterwards, you need to tell me what happened. You know, so what was it? Did they feel comfortable? Did they not? Did something happen in the middle of this? You know, how did that work in with what they were doing? What could you learn about the setting when you were there? So, you know, if you do, I love interviewing people in their own homes. You learn so much about being in their house. You learn about how accepting they are of having you there. So, you know, and I have my cup of tea test. You know, if you go in and they offer you a cup of tea, and you start off informally, you know that they're on board and they're kind of thinking about it. If they go in and then there's nothing and they just start, right, what do you want? You know that you've got a job of work to do, and that may not actually work. So all that stuff is really important, and it has to come in. And what we've moved to is this idea, and again, it's the technocratic thing. We're turning an interview into something like, you know, someone's got a Zoom call, and then that's it. And I go, but what else are we missing? What's going on in the background? We don't even know that. It's all blurred. And, you know, what's happening? And I just think it's a real issue. And all I keep hearing is people saying how fantastic it is and how great it is, and we can collect our data like this. But there are limitations of doing that. Yeah, you can get access probably to clinicians that you might struggle to, because, you know, they can do a 30-minute call with you in between things. But actually just make that effort and say, okay, well, I'll go and sit in your waiting room, and, you know, and hopefully you can slot that 30 minutes in, because you'll learn more by sitting in that waiting room about the whole thing. And I just think we need to be really careful about what we're doing, and not be, you know, those things that have happened in the pandemic, not just think, oh, well, that's great, we've got a technical solution, because this isn't about being technical. This is about really understanding what you've got. And I absolutely agree with Tim, really good, and I've been fighting this for ages, a really good thematic analysis is absolutely fantastic, you know, but it's not a listing of themes. And the worst you get is where people just give you a page of what somebody said, and I'm sitting there going, well, what do you want me to make of that? What is that? I don't need a page of quotes. I want you to tell me what you've made of this, and just then support it with it. So, sorry, that's my rant as well.
Okay. Can I,
Go on, Tracy, you do.
a couple of brief points, because maybe a slightly more optimistic view than Tim's here about the challenges of ethics. Is what I would say is, goes back to what we were saying yesterday about adapting things as you go along and spotting opportunities. And I agree, we need more observational work of this kind that we're talking about. And there are two projects whose team members are in this room where we are changing the protocol and bringing in observation in both of those projects. And yes, it means ethics amendments. It depends what it is, how tricky it is to get through. But there are opportunities if you're prepared to spot them and say, let's bring this in, let's adjust the ethics application, let's try and do it. It won't work for everything, but sometimes you can. And so, and one of those projects has done some work which has already been really valuable, and we weren't planning to do it, and that was about observing intervention delivery. And again, the online thing, sometimes the online thing offers new opportunities that wouldn't have been possible before.
Yeah,
So
it's both ends.
it is, and it's recognising the limits, and you've really nicely summarised some of the limits to the online stuff. And sometimes there are advantages, and as long as you understand them, you can work with it and get something from it. So, so I was, that will do.
Look what happens when you have face-to-face. You can have 4 people whittering on to themselves while you look on. Do you know what I mean? What a joy that is, rather than doing
I only have two more questions.
Okay.
And actually, I don't know about you, but I thought that was really interesting. So.
Can I just want to add one more thing? Unsurprisingly, I just want to come back and say I would love people to have really lovely descriptions. Starting with a really lovely description is just beautiful.
Yeah.
That actually, that's the starting point. So even that is just great. And that's what I say to all students: just start with some description really beautifully, and then we can go from there. And that's, if it's nothing more than that, that's great. But if we can understand the phenomenon by describing it, rather than rendering it, sometimes mangling it through themes, or mangling it through codes, or mangling it through frameworks and models and other kind of things.
It's kind of the difference between cathedral city cheddar and an artisan-produced Somerset brie. You know, I don't want to make too much of it, but one of the things that people forget about this sort of work is that it is hugely demanding in terms of skill, actual skill, the ability to go and do the job. You can always tell, you know, what a cathedral city paper looks like, you know, and it's very different to artisan Somerset brie. I wish I hadn't gone down this road, incidentally, but anyway.
Yeah, but I have to say there is a time and place for cathedral city, because people need jobs and people have only got a certain amount of time. And every now and again, you can produce, if you feel the urge, an artisan brie. I mean, there's just a kind of level of
Yeah, I think it's good to push our aspirations high as well. I mean, we never aimed at Cathedral City. I've got a question primarily for you, Carl, but I think I like all of your perspectives on this. And this, I guess, I'm going to slightly reframe what you had in front of you, so just to warn you. So you mentioned earlier, Carl, you know, being told that there was no place for sociology in implementation science. And I think now probably we would agree there is a place, but at the moment it's a small place. It's a tiny, maybe on the edge place. So how do we bring the contribution of social science more centrally to implementation to hopefully really help change policy and practice?
careful.
I just want to tell you all, I prepared an answer to a completely different question.
A certain amount of power.
This is what we call an ambush. Except I'm not being ambushed by a cake. The thing here, I think, it goes back to what I was saying about skill, and it goes back to actually the standing of what we do, the status of our activities. Are there any health psychologists in the room? Yeah, there are a couple, okay. The health psychologists did a fantastic job on this. First of all, they renamed themselves translational behavioural medicine. That was a fantastic political move, because it had so many words in it that fitted a kind of big shift. Underneath that is some fantastic scholarship. I mean, some extraordinarily interesting and well-founded research. But, I used to begin talks, especially in America, with this. I would say something like, the thing about organised crime is it'll make you an offer you can't refuse. But the thing about a British sociologist is they'll make you an offer you can't understand. and there is something about that. And in in some branches of my discipline, the very nature of social reality is contested. You can't actually walk into a room full of doctors and say, look, it's all a social construct. Because actually, liver failure for them isn't a social construct. It's something dreadful that happens to the human body. So, one of the powerful things that I've observed is the capacity for any discipline to say something concrete about the world and to actually describe a process or to characterize a set of relationships in a way that people can grasp the significance of. Now, that doesn't mean to say I'm not interested in abstract ideas and that I mean, I've spent a great part of my life writing about the social construction of this or the social construction of that. And it's very important because when we talk about these things, we talk about the creation of the world in which we live. We talk about how humans make their societies. Working a bit more at a micro level, you have to be talking about how people do things. And that's one of the things about NPT, is about what's the work that has to happen to make to make an implementation process. But I kind of feel very much that some of this isn't really about what we research. We also live and experience these processes in our daily life. They're ubiquitous. And everybody here who here is an employee of British University? Okay, hands right up. Yeah. Who here isn't an employee of a British university? So amongst those of you who aren't employees of British University, who also is struggling with a diffuse bureaucracy that has no clear objectives and
Constantly changes.
whatever. And we're all implementing stuff all the time. You know, I've had to, for example, in the course of my professional career, implement professional values. Now, what I implemented was a method of weaponizing social relations so that senior and very intelligent people could destroy each other by claiming that you know, people were not collegial, or they weren't doing this, or they weren't doing that, and that was good fun. But you know, we're constantly involved in implementation processes. We're constantly being exposed to new web-based portals, or chatbots, or things like this. All we need to do as people who are interested in implementation is to look around us, you know, and to read more widely. A great example of such a thing, and I commend this as a strategy. If you're at an airport or on a train, carry with you a copy of Diane Vaughan's book, Controlling Unlawful Organisational Behaviour. Get it out, read it, and people would gradually drift away from you. Even better, if you have an iPhone, rename your hotspot HMRC Surveillance Unit 255. And on a train with Wi-Fi that isn't working, everybody's tethering their laptops to their iPhone, and you can see all the other hotspots, and people get a bit edgy. So we're all involved in implementing. We all see it everywhere, and it's about using if you like, our interpretation of the data of our own real lives to think through some of the problems that we research. Another example, I've been doing a lot of work on what we call burden of treatment, which is the work that you have to do to be a patient. And my primary source of data for that was trying to get my mum and dad through different kinds of healthcare in the NHS and trying to get my dad, who had Alzheimer's disease, any kind of help at all. It's kind of like full of theory and propositions and all the things that I do to make an argument. But actually my primary source of data was the things that were happening in my own family. And the obduracy of a hospital system confronted with people that it didn't want to treat or care for. So there's a thing here about how we carry our everyday observations and our everyday, because we all create theories all the time. We make theories all the time. We explain why something isn't happening. And we rarely say, well, this hospital isn't working in this way because everybody's possessed by demons. We say, oh, well, there's some issues of bureaucracy and this department can't talk to that department and things like that. We're constantly producing theories of why things happen or don't happen. I kind of rest my case, my lad, but yeah.
The current theory implementation I'm grappling with is my youngest son has been taught by his sister to do that Maria Kondo rolling of your clothes and drawers. And he has a immaculate wardrobe all the time, and he's kept it up for a year, and I just don't understand how that was implemented.
That's very frightening.
Because I certainly don't do it.
Can't you engage in some kind of de-implementation program?
I'm not de-implementing something that makes one person tidying a household. That would be an act of great insanity. I want to leave some time for questions, and also maybe to circle back to the point that Tim and Tracy made about what you think are the kind of challenges going forward. But I'm going to ask each of you for your one. I really like your language, Tim, of attempts to escape. So what is it that we're trying to get out of where we are now? What's the big thing you would do if you wanted things to be different in the work that we're doing? What could we do differently? You can be as imaginative and unrealistic as you like, and then we'll go to questions, or if you've got something you think would really help us make this work more influential going forward, and then we get lunch.
It is what I've been moaning on about again and again. Create some space in your diary to collaborate, basically.
That should be doable,
to
right?
have
Take that
new
away.
conversations. Yeah.
Tracy.
I would say be a bit more confident and try new things. Yeah, it's reiterating what we've been saying, but don't be afraid and just seek advice from people that may help that. And I think I've seen a huge amount of that happening today and yesterday, so there's a good place to start for me.
And there's some confidence to realising there's a tribe around you.
Yeah, the tribe. Yeah,
it's a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, I kind of think grow your skills, grow your practical capacity to do this work and to think about its implications and to understand the phenomena that it's back to the artisan Somerset Brie, but remember, blessed are the cheesemakers and all purveyors of dairy produce.
Great, it's always good to go last on these things, isn't it? Especially when you've got Carl next to you. What would I say? I think I would combine it. I combine these, apart from maybe the cheese, and just say I think it's about making the space to be able to speak to people who are different to you, but finding your tribe, but also only work with people that you like.
Yeah.
Yes.
Because it's the most hideous thing to have to work with people that you don't, or that aren't wanting to collaborate, who just want to suck what you know and take it away. So be strong in terms of don't work with those people who are not going to appreciate what you do, but are just going to stick you on because it will, you know, it will look good, and you'll stick a little bit of implementation at the end and kind of smear it on.
The key phrase for that is, and this is my current motto, this is the work. It's to minimise the nonsense and maximise the joy, basically.
Brilliant. There you go. Like he said.
And it's okay to like people who think different.
Yep.
But you
Oh, yeah,
have
no.
to do a bit of work
Yeah.
to get
Yep.
into a place where you can talk together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so it's over to you. So it could be questions, or if you've got like something that would really help you in working forward, that we as a community can help with. You know, these are people who are influencers. Or if there's something in particular that you've got as an idea that, you know, would be something that you're going to take away and do differently, then this is a great time to share that. We've got 15 minutes. Hi.
Hiya. Thanks for that. I think Carl's a master of chaos, I've got to say. What you said with the train journey. I like that. What I was going to say is, I'm sort of faced in a world where people don't want to be criticised, or they don't want to share criticism. And so we end up with doing like 40 interviews, and everybody starts to say the same thing. Oh, it's great. It's the best thing since sliced bread. And, you know, and that's great, and that's lovely to hear. But how can we probe and, you know, maybe probe those difficult subjects and allow people to feel comfortable in saying, actually, this does not work well, without the fear of whether they're quoted anonymously in a transcript or in a report or something like that, that despite all that and the safeguarding that we do, they might still be worried that somebody who they know or acquaintance with will know that just because of the way that they speak, they know they've said it. And then the repercussions of that. And it just sort of made me think how can we have those difficult, challenging conversations, which in the long term might do some good if everybody knows about it and can relate to that. For example, ethical approval. I'm sure we've all had our dramas with ethics from time to time. And sort of find a work around that where we can have a safe space and it can be shared in a similar safe space when it's published or when a report's written or it goes back to a fund or whatever.
So, Carl, how can we be critical friends rather than just critical?
I think there are several people in this room who know what an appallingly bad interviewer I am. And two of them are sitting on my right. But the thing about trying to get people to talk to you about things that they might be uncomfortable to say, the way that I've always suggested that people do this is, instead of saying, "What do you think?" to say something like, "What would somebody like you do? What would somebody in your position, or thinking about people you know, why do they think that this web-based portal is a waste of time and money?" So that you relieve them of the burden of culpability. That's one of the things that especially evaluation studies does is, of course, it exposes everybody to evaluation. And I don't know how you feel about being evaluated annually, but I find it sort of a bit insulting, really, that anybody should want to evaluate me. Yeah. Or my cheese making. But relieving the participants in your study of the burden of culpability for failure, while allowing them the burden, the anti-burden of triumph, is a great way of gathering data. And it builds the rapport and the relationship in practice. So that's one way to do it. I mean, there are other ways, but that's how I've always advised my colleagues and students to work around that sort of stuff.
It comes back to what we're saying about skills and really thinking about our interview topic guides, who the people are, and it's not just, I think that's a good one, at Carl, and I had a conversation with someone recently about exactly that, you know, depersonalizing it in terms of putting all the accountability onto that person, that's their view, and it's a view that might be shared by others, but also things like where you put certain questions in the flow of an interview topic guide is really key. And I think, you know, sometimes we maybe aren't paying enough as much attention to that as we could, but you've got to think about it from the perspective of what will make this person feel comfortable and reassured and not being judged, and that is a skill, but that's what we do as qualitative researchers. We have these skills, and we should also get feedback from others. That's the key.
I think there's 2 points. If we think about the politics of transcription, there is a fetish for the quote. We can blend quotes, we can play with it. One of the practical problems we have is we often work with very small communities that can really easily identify themselves. And actually, given our stories are blended stories, why can't we muck around and blend quotes? This is just about the politics and poetics of presentation. We just can reframe some of that if you're really worried. And equally, I think there's a level of, I'm more than aware in some studies, people have used the interview to get very specific points across because they want certain actors and organisations to listen to them. And it's been the other way around. And finally, I think, I don't see why, basically my PhD was a conversation analysis about how interviews happened many, 20-something years ago. And I don't see why interviews should always be collaborative. Why do we have this fetish for only good knowledge is collaborative knowledge? Sometimes they could be antagonistic moments. Sometimes they could be moments for difference and other questions. I mean, within boundaries of safety and niceness, but we can agree to disagree. And then there's the kind of pragmatics of a lot of the ways we often do that. We see these interviews as key moments, but they're just, and this is no disrespect to the interviewees, but they're just part of the broader analytic process of trying to make sense of the story. We can come back to that person sometimes, but equally we can come back to that idea with someone else. I don't need everyone to say it, to understand it, to make sense of it. And sometimes someone says it, and then I'll play it back in another interview. Oh, I've heard from other people it's X, Y, and Z. There's ways to play with this stuff. So interviews are just part of that kind of broader process around those kind of things. But there's a kind of, I'll shut up.
I'm going to come to you. Your turn.
Hi, thank you for a really interesting discussion. One of the reflections I have in working in implementation science is that there's a certain challenge around sort of translating across disciplines, as you were saying in your talk just now. And as a PhD student, I use very behavioural science approaches to measure implementation. And then now I've branched out more into health service research, taking a bit of a wider view on it, which is really helpful. But I wonder how we can learn across the silos to kind of bridge that gap a bit, because I think there's different ways it's talked about in different disciplines. And actually that can be quite an interesting challenge when disseminating your research at different conferences that have different disciplines and things like that. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on how we can sort of bridge disciplinary differences in order to sort of create holistic approaches to implementation that can share different methods, like you were saying, from different disciplines. And if you had any thoughts on how best to do that, because it's a challenge that I think I've come across.
Great question.
I think there's I'm going to shut up.
Fiona, would you like to chip in on this?
I think it is really important. I think it's increasingly being focused on, but I think you've raised all the issues that there are with doing it. So I suppose I go back to that same thing about you need to find your tribe of people who see the value in doing it, not just the people who are doing it, but see the value in it. And then pick your audiences to some extent until you're clear enough to do it. And probably recognise that some audiences are not going to understand what you're doing. So I think it is about, I'd go back to Tracy's point about confidence. It's about thinking it through, being confident about what you're doing and what the value is of bringing those together. So, I do quite a lot in an interdisciplinary space. At UCL, we have a collaborative social science domain, of which I've been on it from the beginning. And there's absolutely fascinating work that goes on there. But it's very I think I'd be wrong to not say that this isn't quite a difficult thing to do, because I think there are people who work in that way, but to be truly interdisciplinary is really hard. It depends on how far you want to travel down that line, and I think that's something that you need to think about with other people. I don't put it all back straight onto you, but I think it is really important. I think it's really important to share, and this is a very parasitic way of thinking, that implementation, and I think it's a value. I don't think that sounds like very negative, but I think it is valuable to move all these perspectives together, and I think it strengthens your own position, but you will need to be really clear about what you're doing and why. I don't know how helpful that is.
I think we've got time for one or two. We've got 5 minutes remaining. Corey.
Yeah, I'm curious. This is a place I'd like to study, but I just want to know if you all have any kind of notes off the top about the relationship between implementation processes or implementation research and social movements, particularly social justice movements. And how do we get in this room, for example, people who look different, right? The diversity, and have different conversations. And I don't know, there's this idea for me that implementation is a tool for justice making. I think this question of how something happens, how we take it from that space and apply it in life is just something that I think someone in custodial services all the way to the president could and would be interested in. How do we do that?
Great question.
Also,
yeah. that might be enough. Somebody?
There's something in all of this about the play of power, isn't there? And it goes back to the question that you were asking as well. When we talk about multidisciplinarity, when we talk about the practical focus of our work, often we're thinking about who is powerful. I think it would be fair to say that in the United Kingdom, most qualitative interviewing is done by younger white women. That there is a gendered division of labour, who are expected to write something about positionality and police their feelings and police their identity in relation to normally. And in medicine, you really see this. You're sitting with a team, often, which is composed of a group of senior doctors, and then a group of more junior people who are doing the qualitative bit. And it's often called the qualitative bit. And I introduce myself to people by saying, well, I do the qualitative bit. So you have these infrastructures of power and difference within a profession. And then you say to them, well, how can we change the world? It's very difficult to change the world without incorporating difference into your social kind of domain. The thing about social movements in this, and Kathy Pope, who's our opposite number at Oxford, did a really good paper about evidence-based medicine as a social movement, and it's not too far from what you're talking about, where she was able to create this wonderful implicit model of how medical power works, just around the mobilization of facts. And when we're talking about, you talked about the carceral society, well, that's founded on the mobilization of facts through algorithms that determine the likelihood of somebody reoffending, through financial, through the privatization and corporatization of criminal justice in the United States. You see a little bit of it here, but nothing like you do in the States. And there's I don't want to seem unreasonably hip, but there's a rapper called Common and and he, I mean, yo, and he called. He had this wonderful thing, and a line stuck with me. He said, "Incarceration is the new plantation." And that brought home to me something very powerful about the American criminal justice system, which is that it's about the economic exploitation of young black men. Now, how do we take this into implementation science? Well, we read more widely, and we read more historically, and we think about where are the natural, because the world seems to us a natural place. The stuff that we're looking at seems inevitable. Of course it all works like this, because that's how it works. But it's not. It's all the production of political choices down the years that accumulate and then roll down the hill and take us all with it. So my answer to your question is, how do we avoid that? Well, we become Sisyphus, don't we, and start trying to roll the thing back up the hill. But we read more widely, we talk to bigger communities, we think about justice. And if it seems that I'm prepared for this, it's because Corey and I, Elvin Gang at the back, and Alice are writing a paper about this very such thing at the moment. So it's just great that I am actually prepared for a question.
But
And I'm going to cut you all off. Just like that. No, just like that. I'm going to stop you. I kind of feel once you've got to Greek mythology and rap, it's lunchtime. It's one of my rules. So thank you very much, everybody. That was an amazing panel session. And thank you.